Welcome to this edition of Lexington Remembers, our long-running television show about Lexington, Lexington people, Lexington organizations. My name is Dan Fenn, and I've done a number of these interviews, but not by any means all of them. If you're interested in the collection, and we have about 50, I guess, now, get in touch with me, get in touch with Lex Media, and we can tell you where you can get them. Cary Library, the Community Center, Lexington Historical Society are the major depositories of these. You know, you and I think about Lexington, and we think about April 19th, and we think about that battle that morning and how the town must have felt. But there was a later event, and we have come to call it, and it's been known as Parker's Revenge. Nobody knew an awful lot about it until, I don't know exactly what happened, but all of a sudden we started trying to find out about this, right? And thank goodness, Meg Watters, a professional archaeologist, was brought in by the Friends of the Minuteman National Historical Park to investigate and find out what we could learn about this event that took place later that same day. So basically, what happened, as I understand it, was that sometime before noon on April 19th, Captain John Parker mustered a group of the militia. They buried their dead. They'd taken care of their wounded. They probably had some kind of a service. They got some kind of provisions. And then he marched them off up the battle road toward Concord, right?
Yes.
And then what did he do? Because there was a place back of the visitor center on the battle road that we always thought was the site of Parker's Revenge. But what did you find out?
Well, we do know from the historical documentation, right, that Captain John Parker mustered his men and walked to the bounds of the towns of Lincoln and Lexington. Beyond that, there's no evidence of where they were or what happened during the Parker's Revenge battle, except for Nathan Monroe, who was one of the militiamen, made a statement 50 years after the battle, and he said, "We met the British within the bounds of Lincoln," which I find very interesting because the results of our study are that the battle was in Lexington, but 50 feet from the boundary between Lincoln and Lexington. So during the research of the project, I have read much of the documentation that exists about the first day of fighting of the Revolutionary War, and really tried to focus in on the Nelson farmstead, which is where this battle was located. And the Nelson family lived and farmed this land for at least more generations. There's still Nelsons out at Minuteman Park now. Because no one knew where the battle was, historians like Sabin, and I'm going to just start that part again so you can clip that, right? So today, there's a wayside or a historic marker on the old Battle Road pathway that identifies the Parker's Revenge battle at the really nice granite outcrop. So that big high stone that you can see right off of Battle Road and Airport Road that runs through there as well. And we really started there with our investigations.
Right, the back of the visitor center, isn't it?
Yeah, if you go out the back door, across the parking lot, across the road, a little bit toward Hanscom Air Force Base, up Airport Road, you'll come right to this great outcrop. And the reason why the sign was put there, because it was a likely spot for the battle.
Right.
It was never, evidenced that this is where it was and we're putting the sign here, but it's a likely spot. And many people believe that it would be a good spot to defend, or a good spot to lay in wait for the British troops to come down the Battle Road. Because from the top of that outcrop, you can see straight down the old Battle Road path that exists today. Okay. Right? So visually you can see it.
Not just what's in front of you, but down
you could see
toward Concord.
Exactly, from an elevated point. So we, that was in our investigation area. And when we began the project, we began with an area that was about 70 acres. So from the Thomas Nelson Jr. house, all the way around the back toward Hanscom Air Force Base, the boundary of the national park itself, and then all the way to the south of that granite outcrop. So we had this large area. We're looking at a landscape. We're looking for evidence of a battle.
So you figured it was in there somewhere.
Well, we hoped it was.
Yeah, right.
Again, that's the looking at all the primary documentation and looking at land deeds, looking at tax records, learning about that landscape. Because what's so important in looking at battlefields is understanding the underlying landscape. Because the landscape in so many ways is related to and can't be separated from the battle that took place on it.
Why?
Well, it's the way people move through a landscape. So if you think tactically, if you begin to turn your view to what we call COCOA, actually, that's an acronym that we use for battlefield assessments, nationally and internationally. It's well known. You're looking at key terrain. What would be advantageous in a battle? A hill, a valley. We're looking at KO. We're looking at observation and fields of fire. What can you see? What can't you see? Which is so important in many battles, and understanding how battles took place and what happened. KOC, concealment and cover. So were there buildings or trenches or stone walls or great big boulders like we have out at Parker's Revenge battlefield? Those are all elements of the landscape that we're beginning to research and understand in the beginning of our process. So it's KOCO. Let's see, obstacles. So obstacles and cover are kind of the same thing, but it depends on what side you're on, what you'd have to move around if you were going in to attack someone.
So if I were a military commander, I would be looking at the landscape in order to stake out my positions and decide where to take the troops.
Exactly.
And where to set up an ambush, if that's what I... But the land is different now than it was then,
It
right?
certainly is. The land is
Different
very
things
different.
there?
Very different. Well, there were houses there in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Right on either side of that granite outcrop, where there were two houses, both had garages, and they had outbuildings, sheds, chicken coops, barbecues, that type of thing, which were removed in the 1950s as the park opened and they acquired the property. So we have this modern, now 21st century landscape that has been greatly impacted by the development from 1775 up to present day. We worked very closely, and we're very fortunate to work with Richard Foreman, who is a professor at the School of Design at Harvard University, and he is an environmental landscape professor, and was able to help us peel away the layers of time and see that the construction of Route 2A and the construction of Airport Road and Hanscom Air Force Base created the wetland that exists today that runs through that end of the park. that wetland did not exist in 1775, which is huge to understand that landscape or terrain that was used in that tactical engagement.
So there wasn't wetland in the area the way there is now. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a stream or a ford or something.
In 1752, I believe it was, Hosmer did maps of Lincoln, created maps of Lincoln. And at the boundary line of Lincoln and Lexington, he just has this dotted double line that's labeled Nelson's Bridge.
Okay.
So we have a bridge, we know there's a bridge, and there is a geological water feature. It's an intermittent flow. It's called a seep, and it happens kind of at the foot of these mountains, of that granite outcrop. At the foot of the mountain range, sorry. So the seep is a geological feature that's at the foot of this granite outcrop, which is the very end of a larger mountain range. And that's where naturally the water table, the groundwater, comes up at the edge of that granite outcrop, or that granite formation. And that's why the bridge was there. Now, there are questions about exactly where it was. And after a lot of consideration, studying the landscape, documentation, archaeological records in the 1950s identified a number of drainage trenches in that area that were related to the agricultural use of the land. Because it was a little damper in that area because of the seep. There were meadows, there were pastures, agriculture, all of that. But that seep, for sure, existed in 1775. And it came across today's Battle Road, but the old Bay Path. And even if it was intermittent, so it wasn't wet, it wasn't a flowing brook or stream or river, but even though seasonally or maybe with a really big downpour, it would flow a little bit, the road being compacted by carts and by animals and by people as the main thoroughfare from Boston to Concord, they would want to put reinforcement at that point in the road because they knew it would be damp and that compaction would impact that moisture level and make it mucky. So that's where we put the bridge.
So you had to find that out. You had to go back to try and figure out what that landscape looked like in 1775 in order to reconstruct how that battle would have taken place.
Yes, to look at the tactical components of the landscape. So we know from colonial farming, you had a certain amount of acres to sustain a family.
40.
And they had a farmyard, and they had agricultural fields, and they had a woodlot because they needed wood. They had an orchard for the apples and the cider. Right, so we know also from past research, because there's been a wealth of research that's gone on in the park, we know that there was a 5-acre woodlot, it's also in the deeds, for Tabitha Nelson's house. And I call it Tabitha Nelson's house. Tabitha Nelson was the daughter of Thomas Nelson Sr. He had twins, Thomas Nelson Jr. and Tabitha. Tabitha never married, and when Thomas Nelson Sr. died, Tabitha Nelson inherited his house. And she was living in that house, if not present, on April 19th, 1775. So I refer to it as the Tabitha Nelson house property. Thomas Nelson Jr., her brother, was just over the way, not very far. They could easily see each other from their house doors. And there was a barn in that area somewhere. This is part of the research as well. We're looking at the landscape. We know there wasn't a wetland there. We know that there was an intermittent damp feature with a bridge. We know there's a woodlot of 5 acres that we've positioned over that stony outcrop because surely you wouldn't plant any crops up there. So trees grow there very nicely today. So it's kind of reconstructing, and it's also based on information from other people like Richard Foreman, who's contributed so much to the project, and Brian Donahue at Brandeis University has done a very large scope of landscape reconstruction for the park itself. in past years. So again, lots of information feeding into this one 70-acre area, right? So it was really interesting, but we knew there was a house in that core area we were investigating, the Tabitha Nelson house, but it doesn't exist today. You can't see it in the landscape. And in the area where it's, reputed to have been, where we know it was, but not exactly, it was all wooded and all tons of weeds and just really inaccessible. So I specialize in remote sensing in archaeology. So I use different techniques and technologies to map underground without digging. So I use airborne laser scanning or LiDAR data. I use ground penetrating radar, magnetometry, different methods to look at the properties of the soil and whatever happens to be in them underground. So in order to do a radar, ground penetrating radar survey and a magnetometry survey and the different methods we used, we actually had to clear a significant, probably about an acre area of that battlefield's 70 acres that we were considering to find this house, to find the barn, because they were key elements in that landscape that would provide concealment and cover or would be a big obstacle for one or the other side that were engaging in the battle.
Right, so it was important to know where that house was.
Absolutely. It kind of anchored so much of what we were doing because, we're looking for a battle.
Right. We know it took place in there somewhere.
Somewhere. But what defines a battle?
Right.
Right? Musket balls. What's the evidence? That's what we're looking for. Not, we've nothing written about, well, it was next to the big tree by the house 20 paces down from the corner. There's nothing is recorded like that. So, the key thing was we need to look for artifacts that will provide evidence to the location of the battle, to the potential action that took place.
So now we know there was a bridge in here somewhere. We know there was some potential wet area. We know the line of the bay path. We know where the bay path was. We know where there's some cover up on the, but we don't know where that house was.
No.
And that affects where you would stand. I mean, if you had a musket company, you weren't going to stand where you're going to fire into the house, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you could use the house for cover.
Right.
You could hide behind the house and be ready to hit the column of British soldiers as they marched by. So fortunately, using these techniques, the non-invasive survey techniques, we found likely features in our data that we excavated, and we found the basement corner of the existing foundation of the Tabitha Nelson house. So we were able to definitively place that house in our maps on the landscape. Okay, so it had been excavated previously in the 1950s, but it had never been mapped. So we knew, we had a good idea of where it was around this hill, and that's where we really focused our surveys. But we weren't interested in only the house. We were interested in the barn. Where was the barn, which we never found? Where could we find the privy, the outhouse? Where they went to? Could we find, all of these key cover or obstacles in a battle? So it's really, we started the whole project looking at this landscape and recreating a landscape as it, as closely as we could to as it existed in 1775, in April of 1775, right? We know what our winters are like here. In April, the snow's melting, so the water table is probably higher. But Richard Foreman provided information to me that there was a drought for the 3 years preceding 1775. So it was the lowest water table in that area in years. So, all of these factors from all different disciplines, it's been pretty fascinating working with so many different people, with wonderful expertise, you know, that are just contributing to and volunteering to help in building this foundation of the battlefield. So that was important, because where do you, again, I come back to, where do you look for artifacts? Like, we could go out over 70 acres and try to find musket balls, but that's a huge area.
Yeah.
So really creating that landscape.
So then you could know where to look.
Yes.
For the hard physical evidence.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
That helped us understand where to focus, or I like to say to, you know, kind of click my microscope to the next level and really focus down further. So we've got this big landscape. We did our geophysical surveys over an acre. We identified agricultural details. We identified a house and some of its related features. Now we need to find the artifacts. Now we need to find the musket balls.
Now, there must be a lot of mapping as you go along.
There's a lot of mapping. And I have some of my maps here.
Oh,
and some of them are very dented and spotted from being out in the field with me.
Yeah.
But, you know, what's important to think about with mapping and with archaeology, the discipline of archaeology is fundamentally a science. The position of an artifact within its contextual landscape, so a farmstead, a battle, perhaps even just an open agricultural field, its position in relationship to everything else in that area, historic and modern, is very important. So mapping is fundamental to what we do. And the first things we typically do out on our projects, or that I always do on my projects, is establish a base map. I got a base map in here somewhere. This is one of the surveyors that we worked with. I asked them to establish a permanent survey line. So it's called a survey control. And we have that going down Airport Road right now. And these pins are in the road, and they're not coming out until the road is ripped up. So I can go back anytime. Any other person who's doing research out there can go back out at any time, and they can relocate any of the information that we actually identified and mapped as part of the project. These are our geophysical survey grids. Every 20 meters, we have corners, every 20 meters. Because when we collect data, you know, you collect it for one small part of the earth at a time. So you really want to keep your lines very straight and your spatial distribution of data very accurate. So this all builds up and builds up.
Maybe we should hold it up.
Sure.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Good.
So the control line is just down along there.
And where's the visitor center, Meg? Just to help me orient myself.
This is it right here, the visitor center. Yep.
Here's the visitor center on 2A. Okay.
And this is the pathway. So the parking lot would be right here.
Right.
You come up and you come down Battle Road this way. And then the granite outcrop is right here.
Yeah.
This area right here.
Yep.
All right. So this is our grid. These helped us orient when we did our metal detecting survey or metallic surveys to look for those artifacts. So we had our recreated landscape, and as you can see in this image, all those different colored blocks represent different things. The woodlot here, pasture, agriculture down here, meadows in here. This is an orchard. And here is the bridge. I made it nice and big on my maps, right? Some of it's graphic, but it's all geospatial. So it's all in a very specific position here. Tabitha Nelson's house, Thomas Nelson Jr.'s house, right?
So that tells me what it looked like at the time.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that sets the scene. So within that scene, we identified an area between 20 and 25 acres that we felt was the highest likelihood of locating evidence from the battle and of locating musket balls. So we were very fortunate as part of the whole project to have a core group of volunteers working with us, which was very handy because they were out pushing the radar around and moving my flags and collecting data. So it was very helpful to me. But also, as we began our metal detecting surveys and as we actually began to find musket balls and other metallic artifacts and pull them out of the ground, our volunteers were able to look at them and say, oh, this is a something or other button, or this is a something or other shoe buckle. And it was almost like a virtual, as we uncovered them, we were learning what they were. So for me, I'm very, as you might know with my maps, or excuse me, as you might suspect with my maps, I'm a very spatial person. I'm also very visual. So I know wherever, I can go stand out there now and be like, ooh, the buckle came from over there. And
oh, really?
Shoe buckle from there. Yeah, so I can see it in my head.
Yeah.
Of course, I spent, 3 years out there. I sure hope I can see it in my head. But our volunteers were joined by 3 specialists, archaeologists and metal detectorists. One of them was Dr. Doug Scott, who is a world-leading conflict archaeologist and historical archaeologist. He first used metal detecting as one of the first comprehensive archaeological applications to map the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Oh, really?
So by finding the musket balls and by finding the other metal objects related to those battles in the position where they dropped, where they fell, in our case 200, 230 years later, by pulling those out of the ground and mapping them and looking at them and studying them, we're able to say this ball in particular was a British-fired musket ball. And we know that because of its weight. Mm-hmm. So we had, in the end, we have a total of 32 musket balls that identify the location of the Parker's Revenge battle. So we have mapped every single musket ball as it came out of the ground. And we developed a whole protocol working with our volunteers, our experts, and a professional archaeology contract company called the Public Archaeology Lab, or PAL. They're based in Rhode Island. We developed a protocol and a methodology for identifying the beeps in the ground, right? That you can filter out background noise with metal detectors these days, and you can really focus on specific values of lead, that type of thing, or gold, and you can filter other information out. And unfortunately, lead musket balls have exactly the same signature, sound, and numerical value as a pull tab.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we found all the pull tabs. There were a lot more than those than there were musket balls. So we found everything, lots of garbage.
Yeah.
We found beautiful buttons dating from around the time period of the Parker's Revenge battle, and many other artifacts related to the life of the people who were living, on this landscape and farming here for, generations. And it tells us the story of the context of the battle.
Yeah, right.
This wasn't someone's farm. This was, I'm going to say 50 meters, 50 yards, 60 yards from someone's kitchen window, the battle.
Yeah.
Right? So it makes it very personal. You can
Yeah.
really imagine what was going on. So we found these musket balls over a series of 3 weeks. We split the 3 weeks up over a year's time period. So the research was kind of continuously going on from the landscape restoration, the metal detecting, the geophysical surveys. We phased it all. And in the end, Dr. Scott measured, weighed, and interpreted all of our musket balls. Just about half are British-fired musket balls, and just about half are colonial-fired musket balls. And we have one dropped colonial musket ball.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did you find any flint?
No.
Because it's interesting, in Punkatasset Hill in Concord, they, as you know, they found a line of flints. And, what had happened was the order was given to move down the hill and to replace their flints. Mm-hmm. So they all took the flints out of their musket and put new flint in, and they had this where they were lined up. But you found no flint.
We did not, but we weren't looking for flints. We were looking for metal.
Yeah, right.
And we didn't find any flints related, you know, in the holes that we dug to retrieve the
metal.
musket balls from the ground.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's a future thing that we could consider.
Yeah.
We know where all these came out of the ground, you know.
Yeah, they would probably be, you know, obviously before the firing started, they
Yeah.
would have replaced the
Yeah.
flints the way
Yeah.
they did at Punkatassett Hill. So, you know, I did some great archaeology. I'm in southern Ireland, and I sat there with that little trowel thing, you know, and but you've been into this a long time. This is serious stuff. How did you ever get into this?
Into archaeology.
Yeah.
Well, I have a number of different pathways or interests that were piqued. Back in the 1980s, a fellow named Dr. Farouk Albaz, who is at Boston University now, the director of the Remote Sensing Center, he was working with the Smithsonian Institute, and he was looking at radar or side aperture radar data of the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
And he mapped paleo or old riverbeds through the sand. And it was huge news. And I remember seeing that. I would have been in junior high school maybe. And I remember being very impressed that you could actually see through the earth to what lied underneath.
Mm-hmm.
I also, when I was an undergraduate at Trinity College in Hartford, I did a semester abroad in Italy. Mm-hmm. And I studied in Rome, and I was a classics major, so I was studying ancient history and the language, and we went to so many sites, and I was just blown away by it all. And then, this is what got me in the end, really got me and reeled me in. After I graduated from college, I was actually working at Harvard University as a secretary, and I was taking an evening course on the archaeology of the Athenian Agora. And my instructor, toward the end of the course, said, "Oh, you know, you should go dig over there." And I'm like, "Oh, sure, I'll just go dig in Athens. Why not?"
Yeah.
And I did. In the end, I followed the process, and I was accepted on the course, and I dug for a summer, and then I stayed, and I, you know, had my backpack, and I taught English as a foreign language. And for that next summer, I had met someone and agreed to be his assistant for an Earthwatch program.
Ah, Earthwatch.
And he was, Dr. McCoy is a volcanologist, and he was studying the eruption of Santorini, or the island of Thera, in the Minoan era. And I came out to work with him, kind of looking at the archaeological side of things and geological side of things. And he brought out a team with ground-penetrating radar that was old, that we strapped on a donkey. All the equipment, you had car batteries operating this thing. It had this paper that scrolled out, and it was actually like an electromagnetic scratching, burning in the paper, the radar signals as they were reflected back up to the antenna that we dragged behind this donkey. And we were mapping buildings under the ground that were covered by the eruption of the island.
Okay.
And again, I was like, wow, like I could look at a whole this is from the very beginning, I could look at this landscape without, I'm not lazy, but without digging it, right? Or I could glean some information out about what might be there. So then I could say, oh, well, why don't you look over here? And you can look here, and you can look here, and let's see what we find, and then work down another layer.
Yeah.
And that right after that summer, I applied to and was accepted to Boston University to their archaeology program. Mm-hmm. And I worked with Professor Ken Kavami, who does remote sensing. And from there, I just ran with it and have since, you know, completed a Ph.D. I work in 3D visualization.
Where did you get your Ph.D.?
I studied at the University of Birmingham in England.
Okay.
And I was invited to come help build their visual and Vista. This is horrible. I can't remember the name of the program. Anyway, I was invited to come over and help build their visualization center and incorporate the geophysical surveys and methods that I use into their program more mainstream. So I earned a Ph.D. and I taught students, and in fact met my husband, who does all the airborne laser scanning and aerial photography, and he does ground-based laser scanning as well. So together we're able to do whole environments of above ground and below ground, which is a wonderful approach to a park like Minuteman Park, which we engaged all those techniques. And part of the product of that work is providing information for future management and planning and interpretation of that end of the park.
And I think I've seen you on TV.
Yes, occasionally. I was, for the second series, the science consultant and a presenter on Time Team America. And the essence of the program...
Seeing you running around fields with...
scanning a lot.
That's right.
I had a wonderful team. I had two people that helped me who in their own rights are professors and professionals now, and we mapped archaeological sites, working with each site's local archaeology team to help provide information for them to better understand and interpret the work that they were doing. And my contribution was to provide these maps, look at new evolving technologies that we might be able to apply to learn something new. And then my information was given to the rest of the team, of the Time Team archaeologists. And they worked again with a local archaeologist to choose areas to excavate and investigate. And we looked at really the underlying scientific methodology of archaeology and how that's actually used, every day in the work that we do. Okay,
so it makes total sense for you to be involved in the Parker's Revenge thing. And thanks to your work and these other people, we now know there was a battle. We now know where that battle was. We now know why it was where it was. What are we going to do with it? That's very interesting, but what are we going to do with that?
Right. Well, there's one more thing we can add to, we knew where it was. We had actually something called a military tactical review at the very end of our project. And Jim Hollister and I, Jim Hollister is one of the lead interpretive rangers and military specialists at the Minuteman National Historical Park. He and I worked together to propose, which was approved by the management committee of the project, to host an event for a day and a half where we invited specialists from all different backgrounds to come together to be presented with the historical information that we have and we have access to for that first day of fighting of the American Revolution, and the new evidence that we have, the musket balls, the historic landscape, right? That was a huge part of the project, is recreating that. So we had around 20 folks. We had active military strategists. We had veterans from the Vietnam War and the Gulf War. We had conflict archaeologists, historians. We had wonderful, landscape folks and environmental folks, and just this wonderful collection of experts come together from different backgrounds, British side and colonial side, and some with perhaps a very strong viewpoint about what happened during the Parker's Revenge battle and why. Right. So, and it was fascinating as someone who helped organize it, because I know all the people who came, because I've read all the work they've done, because they, it all contributed to the project. And we presented all this information in the morning and gave them packets of information to review before the event. And then we set the site up so that where each of the musket balls was actually pulled out of the ground and mapped, we had stakes in the ground with a red flag or a blue flag identifying the British and the colonial fired musket balls. So we had the positions of the British line of fire and the colonial line of fire. And we identified where the woodlot would have been and Tabitha Nelson's house and the bridge, the Nelson Bridge. And we did visual cues in the landscape so that when we brought people out, the first time we went out to site to talk, we came over the back of that granite outcrop. We came into the battlefield area as the Lexington militia would have.
Right.
And we asked people, based on the information and discussions we had in the morning, think about the evidence. Think about what's in front of you that you see.
Yeah.
What do you think happened? Right?
Yeah.
And then we had lunch, we talked about it, and we came in a second time to the site, but from Battle Road. So we came in a column.
The way the regulars would have.
The way the regulars would have. And what did they see? What would that have been like for them? So we really were kind of immersing our group of specialists in that landscape as best we could, presenting them with the evidence of the battle, and then saying, all right, let's talk about this. What happened?
Yeah, what happened? What happened? So you come out of this with a good sense of, ideal sense of where it was, and a good idea of what happened.
Absolutely.
What people did, where they stood, where they moved.
Yeah, let me show you this map. Nope, let me show you this map. This map shows a representation. It's not quite complete because it's one of my working maps, but I thought I'd bring it anyway, of where the colonial fired musket balls were located.
Oh, okay.
And where the British fired musket balls were located.
So if the musket balls were there, the colonials were up here somewhere, because the musket ball only carried 50
yards,
70 feet.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is where we began really thinking about, we know where people were, but how did they get there? And how did they choose that terrain to either lay in wait as the militia did? And the British, how did the British know that people were in here? How did they know to come through Battle Road? So this is the west.
Right.
They're coming from the west.
Right.
And this is the final interpretation that we came up with. There are a few options, but the final interpretation was that the British column was working with the tactic of what was labeled the ball and the snake. So the vanguard was out in front of the column of approximately 700 British regular soldiers, right? And so the column is the vanguard's out in front. Their job is to protect the column.
Right.
Their job is to get rid of any obstacle that might be in the way, if they can. The other tactic that was employed by the British was to have flanking units out either side of the column and sweeping through the landscape.
They had light infantry as well as grenadiers.
So we considered all of the discussion we actually had during the military tactical review is an appendix. I typed it all up. It was great. I typed it all up and put it in an appendix so people can kind of follow the line of thought to our final conclusions. So we believe there's a vanguard out front. The vanguard comes all the way up here to the bridge. There's this big turn in the road. Now Miriam's Corner was a bridge and a crossroads.
Right.
Bloody Angle, which they've just less than 2 miles behind them.
Right.
Bloody Angle crossed a brook, right, at this big turn in the road. So here they are, another turn in the road, another bridge. What we think happened is the Lexington militia came down here, and they didn't situate themselves on top of that granite outcrop, because that's not good tactically. One, there's almost a very vertical drop-off on the southern edge, so they really couldn't, there was no egress that was very safe. But also, they would be silhouetted with light behind them if they were out from behind trees. Instead, they came down to the middle, right here, of that formation, kind of that outcrop formation there. This is the intermittent seep that's coming. That's the geological feature. So this is what we call the valley. This is the lowest area, and then this is the highest up on that outcrop. They settled in halfway in the woodlot, potentially using those boulders that are concentrated back in here as cover. So they've got trees as cover, they've got boulders as cover, they can see straight down Battle Road. They can see the column approach, they can hear them. I expect they were concealed and stayed concealed as long as they could here. We believe what happened is that vanguard crossed the bridge and order was given. Out, line up, out, deploy, out along, using that seep feature, which is pretty linear in the beginning at least, as a cue for alignment. Deploy to a certain point, we don't know what that was, and we believe as they were deploying, the colonial force fired once. And we have a line of those musket balls, and then they started retreating, and they ran around using that contour to keep themselves, you know, kind of not hidden, but they would blend in with that woodlot background, and then out over the top of that outcrop. And then by the time the British flankers deployed, they fired up that sweep of hill, and that's why we have a distribution of musket balls up in this direction.
That's when they're leaving.
Right? Yeah. So so the Lexington militia, we believe, fired one shot, turned, and got out of there to meet them again right down at Bloody Bluff, to meet them at Fitch Hill, you know, or Fisk Hill, and back into Lexington. It was a running battle. This was one stop. You know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Stop them, impact them. If you can impact the column, right? If you can impact that column and you can get it to stop, at that point there were, say, around 1,200 colonial militia and Minutemen pressing on the back of the British column. They're not just, you know, kind of idly meandering through the landscape. So all of that, the condition, the breakdown of command and control of the British Army at that point, the fact that they had not planned for any of that action. They thought it would be a quick trip out to Concord and back, and here they are under fire. The men are running out of water. They're running out of ammunition. They don't even know if they're going to get back to Boston. And then this is what they're facing. So
all the way along.
All the way along. So in the consideration of Parker's Revenge, which is one of, 5 battles, let's say, on that day, or 6, or more, of course.
Well, it was a running battle from Merriam's Corner all the way back to Boston.
And it absolutely was. And I like to think, the fact that the Friends of the Minuteman Park and the organization of the project with partners of the park itself, of the Regional National Park Service Office, of the Lexington Minutemen and other volunteer communities, that they really enabled this platform for research, and for research that isn't typical archaeology, like we need to put a new drain pipe in. Come on out and look at our ditch and see if you see anything, right? Because the research is a different thing. You go out and you have an end goal and you pursue, and working with the Friends of the Park who sponsored this whole project. They didn't really, Bob Morris, who's the head of the Friends, occasionally said, no, I don't think we should go in that direction. There are lots of different things I wanted to bring in, like protein analysis. Can we find traces of blood on the musket balls? So we've collected the musket balls in a manner that if in the future it's decided that that's something that's important that will contribute to the interpretation of the site, it can be done. Right, so we've really thought in this process of all the different components of the project, which leads to the question you asked me like 10 minutes ago about what's next. This is the first. The Parker's Revenge project is the first.
Let me just get this musket ball first. This is a replica of a British musket ball, right?
Yes.
And how come it's got this big dent in it here?
Well, we found this musket ball about 1.5 feet from a great big boulder in the field. And we think that this musket ball, when it was fired, hit that boulder, and then fell down. And so the
Yeah.
softer lead
Yeah,
of the musket ball
sure. That makes
was
sense.
deformed. We have wonderful squashed musket balls, and ones that are almost completely round, that didn't hit anything,
Right.
but just deformed a little bit in their flight. And this one actually has a sprue on it. Part of, you can every artifact you look at, you can dig down into. Every artifact has a story to tell. And it's through collecting all of those artifacts and understanding who fired them, at whom, all of this context we've been talking about behind it. This pulls it all together.
Yeah.
This is where it was. This is how it happened, and what came of it.
And as I remember the story, the commanding officer, Francis Smith, was hit, or his horse was hit here, and Jebediah Monroe from
Yes.
Lexington, who had been wounded in the morning, was killed here.
Yes.
Any other Lexington people hit or killed that we know of?
Not that I know of.
And do we know about the British casualties in this engagement?
We don't have any record of British casualties from the Parker's Revenge engagement.
Okay.
In fact, the Parker's Revenge engagement is sometimes difficult in historic records to pull out
Separate
of
from
all that
everything
fighting.
else.
Like you said,
Yeah.
it was a running battle. The entire park is a battlefield of that first day of fighting.
Now, before we get to the question of what comes next
Okay.
in this dramatic story, there are a lot of things we know now that we didn't know 3 years ago, and that we know really for sure, right?
Absolutely.
Where it happened, what happened, how long it was, and so on. We call it Parker's Revenge, which raises the why question. And the why questions we really can't definitively answer, can we? Why did he set forth that noontime? He stops at the Lincoln line. He's right on the Lincoln line.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
He has no way of knowing well, he probably knows the Old North Bridge has happened. There's no way of knowing that, because the couriers are going back and forth. No way of knowing that Merriam's Corner,
Exactly,
where
yep.
the war all the way back started, has happened when he sets out.
Yeah.
And so you say, why is he doing this? Is it revenge? Is he going to shoot up the British as they peacefully march back through?
Peacefully.
Well, no, but I mean, presumably they were going
Well.
to march peacefully back through, right? If Merriam's Corner hadn't started. And they were going to get back to Boston, everything would have been fine. I'm thinking Captain Parker is saying to his guys, hey, listen, let's go out to the Lincoln line and let's shoot up those guys as they come through. I mean, after all, they were pretty nasty to us this morning. Let's get revenge, right? I say, hey, Captain, with all due respect, your house is about 3 miles off where they're my house is the first one they're going to come to. What do you think they're going to do to my house if we've been shooting at them? What do you think they're going to do to the town? Yeah. So, you know, it's a fascinating part of the story to speculate. We know what happened.
Yes.
And we know the battle had started at Merriam's Corner. It's fun to speculate what he had in mind when he started out. And that's the kind of thing that all you can do is
think.
think. All you can do is play with.
And with the military tactical review that we did, of which you contributed to, in this discussion, I found that part of our discussion, which again is in the appendix of the final report, very fascinating because it discussed the context of April 19th. It discussed the context, what were people thinking? What was the religious viewpoint? What were, the whole buildup. It's, again, the battle, while it's not in isolation from a landscape, physical landscape, it's not in isolation as well from the intellectual
the reality
yes,
and what
exactly,
was going on. And from the fact that they all saw themselves as British. And the ambiguity of that day, the ambiguity of the British soldiers helping the Concord townspeople put out the fire burning down the townhouse, the ambiguity of the colonials not chasing the British away from the Old North Bridge, letting the rest of the detachment come back through that was over there after the battle there. And so you'd think, well, the Lexington people must have felt that same ambiguity. Anyway, a lot of big questions. Where now?
Well, right now, so this was phase 1 of a 3-phase Parker's Revenge project that the Friends of the Minuteman Park have established with the park itself. And from the results of all of this research, the second phase is interpretation and outreach. So educational programming, creation of a new exhibit showing the musket balls, having the artifacts that tell that story, and all sorts of interpretive information with that. But also the third phase is looking at restoration of part of the core area of the landscape of the battlefield. So that again, you, as the visitor comes to the park, that experience that they have as they walk down Battle Road and they see where Tabitha Nelson's house was, one way or another, and they understand that the British and Lexington militia lines, those flankers and the militia were 30 yards away from each other. I mean, it's not, they weren't far away. They were right on top of each other. And that, for me, being able to stand in that landscape and see it in my mind's eye, it's incredible to think with these ambiguities we were just discussing, if they didn't win that day, if they didn't win the war, they're all committing treason. And it's that whole, the men who stood up on that day, the militia and the Minutemen, and the support that they had is just an incredible part of our history, the beginning of our history as a country. And I think that's one of the reasons why Parker's Revenge, this battle in particular, was a focus of what was going on, that it was one small battle, that was fought on that day and in the larger war, but it was the second time they met the British. They had their time in the morning, their experience in the morning. They came back, and we don't know why they went there, but we certainly know what they did.
They did, Great. Hey, thank you very much. It's been terrific. And
thank you.
We look forward to the interpretation and the programs and the restoration out there.
It's very exciting. And
thank goodness that you're now permanent. You're working as an archaeologist with the Park Service in the Northeast region.
In the regional, I work on sites from St. Croix Island, which is the first French settlement in North America, down to Jamestown, which is, of course, the first English, and everything
Northeast,
in between.
Jamestown?
It is, Virginia. West Virginia, Virginia.
All right.
And I'd like to thank you for all of what you've contributed to the project, because it was very significant having your support of the project, but also every time I talk with you, I learn something new.
Well, thank you.